The streets of Alpheon shimmered under the light of its 3 moons, casting a soft, otherworldly glow over the bustling city. Wraith Altara stood at the edge of the promenade, his usual polished appearance replaced by the tattered garb of a beggar. His finely chiseled face was smudged with dirt, and his thick, gray hair was hidden beneath a frayed hood. His disguise wasn't perfect, but it was enough to make most people look past him. That was the point. He adjusted the worn scarf around his neck, glancing at his reflection in a shop window. He almost didn't recognize himself. A man who could buy and sell entire planets now dressed like someone who couldn't afford a decent meal. He clenched his jaw, remembering the scathing report he had watched earlier that day. Starspoon, the galaxy's largest restaurant chain, was under fire for mistreating lower-class customers. But no investigation could truly capture what it felt like to be on the receiving end of such treatment. Wraith wanted to see it for himself. He took a deep breath and stepped into the glowing doorway of Starspoon. The restaurant was alive with the hum of chatter, the faint buzz of hollow displays, and the clinking of bioluminescent plates. The air was thick with the scent of charred kelp roots and roasted skyfish, a staple dish on Alpheon. Wraith scanned the room, his sharp eyes taking in every detail. The staff, dressed in sleek silver uniforms, moved efficiently between tables, their faces painted with the forced smiles of those who worked for tips. The instant he stepped inside, the atmosphere shifted. Conversations dipped as patrons turned to glance at him. A woman in a flowing green gown wrinkled her nose and whispered something to her companion. A group of young aliens at a corner table stifled laughter, their gazes locked on his tattered attire. Wraith ignored them, walking up to the order counter. The server behind it, a lanky alien with translucent skin and glowing blue eyes, barely acknowledged him. "Welcome to Starspoon," the server said, his tone dripping with disdain. "Can I help you?" "I'd like a basic meal," Wraith said, keeping his voice steady. The server raised an eyebrow. "The cheapest one?" Wraith nodded. "Sure." The server turned to the kitchen, muttering something to his coworker that Wraith couldn't quite catch. The other employee, a bulky alien with dark green scales, burst into laughter. Wraith clenched his fists under the counter but said nothing. A minute later, the server slammed a tray onto the counter. The food, a plate of glowing green sludge and a wilted piece of bread, looked worse than anything Wraith had seen in his life. "This is what you ordered," the server said, smirking. Wraith stared at the tray. "This food is spoiled." The smirk vanished, replaced by a glare. "Listen, if you don't want it, you can leave. We don't do charity here." "I'm not asking for charity," Wraith said, his voice low and firm. "I'm asking for what I paid for." "Are you serious right now?" The server leaned closer, his glowing eyes narrowing. "Do you even have money? Or did you just crawl in here looking for a handout?" The words hit Wraith like a slap, but he held his ground. "I paid. I deserve the same service as anyone else." A sharp laugh erupted from the kitchen. The green-scaled employee sauntered over, towering over Wraith. "You're making a scene, old man. Maybe this isn't the place for you. I'll leave when I get what I ordered," Wraith said, his voice calm but icy. The larger alien grabbed Wraith's arm. "You're leaving now." Wraith didn't resist as he was dragged toward the door. He let his eyes sweep over the room one last time, taking in the smirking faces of the staff and the indifferent stares of the customers. Only one person, a young alien server with soft pink skin, looked away, her expression tinged with guilt. The door slammed shut behind him, and Wraith found himself back on the promenade, the cool night air biting at his face. He stood there for a moment, staring at the glowing sign of Starspoon. The humiliation burned in his chest, but beneath it, there was something else, a simmering determination. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a sleek communicator. "Get me the acquisition team," he said. "I want the purchase finalized by morning." As the communicator beeped with confirmation, Wraith allowed himself a small, grim smile. They had no idea who they had just thrown out, but they were about to find out. The sun of Alpheon rose slowly, bathing the city's skyline in shades of gold and pink. Wraith Altara sat in his penthouse office, staring out at the bustling world below. A steaming cup of algan brew sat untouched on his desk as he reviewed the acquisition documents projected in front of him. By the end of the night, the deal had gone through. He now owned Starspoon. The process had been laughably easy. The chain's board of directors, eager to escape mounting lawsuits and public backlash, had sold the entire operation for a fraction of its worth. Wraith could have celebrated, but instead, he felt a heavy weight settle over him. Buying the company was just the first step. The real challenge lay in fixing it. He replayed the events of the previous night in his mind. The sneering faces of the staff, the mocking laughter, the spoiled food slapped onto his tray. It wasn't just the one restaurant. The culture of disrespect ran deep, and Wraith was determined to uproot it. But to do that, he needed more than power. He needed to understand what fueled this rot. Wraith stood, pulling on a sleek black jacket, and summoned his assistant with a wave of his hand. The young woman, a sharp-eyed human named Lyra, entered the office quietly. "Prepare a meeting with the regional managers," Wraith said without looking at her. "Yes, sir," Lyra replied, but her tone held a note of hesitation. "What is it?" he asked, turning to face her. "Sir, you've just bought one of the most notorious chains in the galaxy. The media is already asking questions. They're wondering if you'll dismantle it or rebuild it." Wraith smirked faintly. "They'll get their answers soon enough. For now, I need to visit that restaurant again." "Lida Blinkit, started. The one from last night?" "Yes," he said, grabbing a small hollow recorder and slipping it into his pocket. "I need to see it through another lens." By midday, Wraith stood in front of the same Starspoon, this time dressed in his usual immaculate attire. The tailored suit, polished boots, and subtle aura of authority were impossible to miss. He stepped through the glowing doorway, and the change in atmosphere was immediate. The staff, who had been moving with languid indifference, snapped to attention. The server who had mocked him the previous night straightened his posture, his translucent skin glowing brighter with what Wraith could only assume was nervous energy. "Welcome to Starspoon," the server said, his tone saccharine and ingratiating. "How can we assist you today, sir?" Wraith smiled coldly. "A table by the window, please." "Of course, right this way." The server all but tripped over himself to lead Wraith to a prime spot near the expansive glass wall. The view overlooked the vibrant city below, and Wraith took a moment to appreciate the juxtaposition. Inside, artificial courtesy. Outside, a world bustling with the chaos of life. A different server, the young alien with soft pink skin who had shown a flicker of guilt the night before, approached with a menu. Her hands trembled slightly as she placed it on the table. "Welcome to Starspoon, sir," she said softly. "Can I get you started with a drink?" Wraith studied her for a moment. There was a quiet sincerity in her voice, a stark contrast to the forced politeness of her coworkers. "Algan brew," he said. "Hot." She nodded and scurried away. Wraith let his gaze drift across the restaurant. The same manager from the night before stood near the kitchen, barking orders at the staff. His booming voice carried over the hum of conversation, and Wraith caught snippets of his words. "Look sharp. Don't mess this up." A plate of steaming skyfish was placed in front of him moments later, along with a perfectly brewed cup of algan. The pink-skinned server lingered for a moment, as if debating whether to say something. "Is there a problem?" Wraith asked, his tone calm but pointed. She shook her head quickly. "No, sir. I hope you enjoy your meal." Wraith's lips curved into a faint smile. "Thank you. What's your name?" Her large, violet eyes widened. "It's Tali, sir." "Tali," he repeated, storing the name away. "I'll remember that." Her cheeks flushed a deeper pink, and she hurried back to the kitchen. Wraith finished his meal, though he barely tasted it. His mind was occupied, cataloging the behavior of the staff, the dynamics between employees and management, and the overall atmosphere. He activated the holo recorder discreetly, capturing the interactions around him. The polished exterior of the restaurant was a thin veneer, barely hiding the cracks beneath. As he stood to leave, the manager approached him. His scaly green face stretched into a wide, toothy grin. "Thank you for dining with us, sir," the manager said. "I hope everything was to your satisfaction." Wraith's smile didn't reach his eyes. It was enlightening. The manager chuckled nervously, unsure of how to respond. Wraith left without another word, stepping back into the bustling promenade. He stopped just outside the door and glanced back. Through the glass, he could see the staff returning to their usual behavior now that the important customer was gone. He tapped his communicator, connecting to Lyra. "Schedule a meeting with the regional managers tomorrow morning, and prepare the footage I just recorded." "Yes, sir," Lyra replied. "Anything else?" Wraith hesitated for a moment, his thoughts drifting to Tali. "Yes, look into the employee records of the staff at the flagship Starspoon. I want to know everything about them, especially one named Tali." As he walked away, the glowing sign of Starspoon cast his shadow long across the promenade. He could already see the cracks in its foundation, but the question remained. Could he rebuild it into something worth standing tall? Tomorrow he would begin tearing it apart to find out. The conference room in Wraith Altar's corporate headquarters was an imposing space. Its polished obsidian table stretched nearly the length of the room, surrounded by sleek, high-backed chairs. Floor-to-ceiling windows bathed the space in natural light, offering a panoramic view of Alfion's sprawling skyline. Wraith stood at the head of the table, his expression as cold and unyielding as the walls around him. Across from him sat the regional managers of Starspoon, a collection of alien species, each trying, and failing, to hide their discomfort. They had all heard the news. Their new owner was not a faceless corporation but a single man, one with a reputation for ruthlessness and precision. Wraith allowed the silence to stretch, watching as they fidgeted under his gaze. Finally, he broke it. "Last night," he began, his voice low but commanding, "I visited one of your flagship restaurants, disguised." The statement hit the room like a thunderbolt. A few managers exchanged nervous glances. Others stiffened in their seats. "I experienced the treatment your customers endure firsthand," Wraith continued, his tone sharp enough to cut steel. "What I found was unacceptable. Disrespect, discrimination, and blatant incompetence." One of the managers, a stout alien with metallic bronze skin, cleared his throat. "With all due respect, Mr. Altara, isolated incidents don't reflect the company as a whole. Starspoon serves billions of customers across the galaxy." "Spare me the excuses," Wraith interrupted, his eyes narrowing. "This wasn't an isolated incident. I've reviewed countless reports of similar behavior across your locations. Discrimination against the poor, negligence toward quality, and an entrenched culture of arrogance. Tell me, how does this serve billions?" The manager fell silent, his metallic sheen dimming. Wraith tapped a control panel on the table, and the room darkened as a holographic display illuminated above the table. Footage from his visits to Starspoon played for all to see. The sneers, the mocking tones, the spoiled food. All of it was laid bare. Gasps rippled through the room as the managers watched their company's dirty laundry displayed in high definition. "I've already fired the worst offenders at this location," Wraith said, his voice icy. "But this is not just about one restaurant. This is about all of you." A tall, violet-skinned alien at the far end of the table spoke up, her tone measured but firm. "Mr. Altara, you've made your point. But if I may, this kind of change takes time. The culture you're describing is deeply rooted. It won't be fixed overnight." Wraith inclined his head slightly. "You're right. It won't be fixed overnight. But it will be fixed. I'm implementing a mandatory training program for all employees, starting with management. That includes everyone in this room." The violet-skinned manager's calm facade faltered. "Training? For us?" "Yes," Wraith said. "If you can't lead by example, you're part of the problem. And if you're unwilling to change, you're free to resign. Effective immediately." The silence that followed was deafening. After the meeting, Wraith returned to his office, his mind racing with the challenges ahead. The board had been too eager to sell Starspoon, leaving him with a mess that would take months. if not years, to clean up. But he had no intention of backing down. A soft chime interrupted his thoughts, and Lyra stepped into the room, a tablet in hand. "You asked for the employee records from the flagship location," she said, placing the device on his desk. "I've highlighted the staff you might find interesting, including Tali." Wraith picked up the tablet, his eyes scanning the information. Tali Mevra, 23 standard cycles, had been working at Starspoon for 2 years. Her record was spotless, with multiple commendations from customers. But she had also received disciplinary warnings for unauthorized acts of kindness, such as giving extra food to struggling patrons. Wraith felt a flicker of curiosity. Tali's actions, while against company policy, spoke of a character starkly different from the rest of the staff. She had been the only one to show him any shred of dignity during his visit, and he intended to find out why. "Schedule a private meeting with her," Wraith said. Lyra raised an eyebrow but nodded. "Consider it done." The following day, Tali sat nervously in a chair across from Wraith in a smaller, more intimate meeting room. Her pink skin flushed deeper as she avoided his piercing gaze. "Do you know why you're here?" Wraith asked, leaning back in his chair. "No, sir," Tali replied, her voice barely above a whisper. Wraith studied her for a moment before sliding the tablet across the table. "I've reviewed your record. You've been reprimanded for acts of kindness. Care to explain?" Tali hesitated, her hands fidgeting in her lap. I don't think it's right to turn people away when they're hungry. Even if they can't afford much, they deserve to be treated with respect." Her words hung in the air, simple but profound. Wraith leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "You were the only person in that restaurant who treated me like a person," he said. "Why?" Tali's eyes widened. "That was you? The man from last night?" Wraith nodded. Tali's face turned a deep crimson, and she looked down at her hands. I didn't think it was fair what they were doing to you. It doesn't matter who someone is or what they look like. Everyone deserves decency." Wraith felt a spark of something he hadn't felt in a long time, hope. He leaned back again, his gaze thoughtful. "Would you be willing to help me change that culture?" he asked. Tali's head shot up, her violet eyes wide with surprise. "Me? What can I do?" "You've already done it," Wraith said. "You showed compassion when no one else did. That's exactly what I need in my leadership team." Tali blinked, stunned. "Leadership team? I don't understand." "You will," Wraith said, standing and extending a hand. "If you're willing to take the risk." After a moment's hesitation, Tali reached out and took his hand. Her grip was firm, her expression determined. Wraith allowed himself a small smile. "Good. Let's get to work." Tali felt like she was walking through a dream, though whether it was pleasant or a nightmare, she couldn't yet decide. The meeting with Wraith Altara, the most powerful man she'd ever encountered, had left her head spinning. Leadership? Culture change? She had come into work expecting a typical day of dodging rude customers and enduring her manager's wrath. Not this. The air around her seemed lighter as she stepped back into the main floor of Starspoon. Her co-workers barely noticed her return, consumed by their usual routines of half-hearted service and whispered complaints. Tali hesitated near the kitchen door, stealing a glance toward the manager's office. Its door was closed, but she knew the man inside wouldn't stay oblivious for long. As if on cue, the door swung open, and Lorne Dren, her manager, stormed out. His scaled brow was furrowed, his gaze sweeping the room like a predator searching for prey. He caught sight of Tali and narrowed his eyes. "You," he barked, pointing a clawed finger at her. "What were you doing in there?" Tali stiffened, clutching the tablet Wraith had given her, a sleek device containing her onboarding materials for the leadership role she still couldn't believe was real. I had a meeting," she said, her voice firmer than she expected. "With who?" Lorne demanded, striding closer. His imposing frame towered over her, the sharp ridges of his shoulders casting jagged shadows. Tali swallowed hard but stood her ground. "Mr. Altara." The words seemed to physically stagger Lorne. His eyes widened briefly before narrowing again. his voice dropping to a dangerous growl. What could you possibly have to discuss with someone like him? That's between him and me, Tali replied, surprising herself with the steadiness of her tone. Lawrence's mouth twisted into a sneer, but before he could respond, the restaurant's entrance chimed. A pair of figures stepped inside, their elegant attire and confident postures drawing immediate attention. Wraith had returned, flanked by Lyra, his ever-efficient assistant. The room fell silent as every employee turned to watch. Lawrence's expression shifted instantly, his hostility replaced with an almost comical attempt at deference. He straightened his posture and smoothed the front of his uniform. "Mr. Altara," Lawrence said, his voice oozing false warmth. "What an unexpected pleasure. What brings you back so soon?" Wraith didn't acknowledge him immediately. His sharp gaze swept the room, lingering briefly on each employee. When his eyes landed on Tali, a faint smile tugged at the corner of his lips. He stepped past Lorne without a word, stopping in front of Tali. "Are you ready to begin?" he asked, his tone calm but laced with expectation. Tali nodded, clutching the tablet tighter. "Yes, sir." "Good." Wraith turned back to the rest of the staff, his voice carrying effortlessly across the room. "Everyone, gather around. I have an announcement to make." The employees exchanged uneasy glances but obeyed, forming a loose circle near the center of the dining area. Lorne hovered at the edge, his face a mask of poorly concealed irritation. "As you're all aware, I'm now the owner of Starspoon," Wraith began, his hands clasped behind his back. "And as of today, there will be changes. Significant ones." A murmur rippled through the group, quickly silenced by Wraith's piercing gaze. "Tali Mevra has been promoted to a leadership role within this location," he continued. "She will be assisting me directly in implementing these changes. I expect you to treat her with the same respect you would show me." The announcement landed like a shockwave. Tali could feel the stares of her co-workers boring into her, a mix of disbelief, envy, and resentment. Lawrence stepped forward, his face an unreadable mask. "Mr. Altara, with all due respect, Tali is inexperienced. She's a fine server, but—" Wraith held up a hand, silencing him. "Her actions last night demonstrated qualities this establishment sorely lacks: compassion, integrity, and genuine respect for others. If you believe experience is more valuable than those traits, I suggest you reconsider your priorities." Lawrence's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue further. "Tali," Wraith said, turning back to her, "you'll begin by observing and identifying areas for improvement. Report directly to me. I'll be in my office reviewing proposals for the new training program." Tali nodded, her heart pounding in her chest. "Yes, sir." Wraith's gaze softened slightly. "You'll do well." With that, he turned and left the restaurant, Lyra trailing behind him. The rest of the day was a blur for Tali. She tried to focus on her new responsibilities, observing her coworkers and taking notes on the tablet, but the weight of their judgment was suffocating. Every whispered comment, every sideways glance felt like a dagger. By the time her shift ended, she was exhausted, mentally and emotionally. She retreated to a quiet corner of the staff break room, clutching the tablet like a lifeline. "Hey," a voice said, pulling her from her thoughts. She looked up to see one of her coworkers, a young alien with pale green skin and a nervous smile. His name was Kern, and he was one of the few who had never treated her poorly. "Congratulations," he said, his tone earnest. "I think you'll do a great job." Tali managed a weak smile. "Thanks, Kern. That means a lot." He hesitated, glancing toward the door to make sure no one else was around. "Just be careful, okay?" Lorne doesn't take kindly to being upstaged. And some of the others, well, they're not happy about this. Tali nodded, her stomach twisting with unease. "I'll be careful." Kern gave her a reassuring pat on the shoulder before leaving the room. Tali leaned back in her chair, letting out a shaky breath. She knew this wouldn't be easy, but she hadn't realized just how lonely it would feel. Still, as daunting as the road ahead seemed, she couldn't shake the memory of Wraith's words. "You'll do well." For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope. The early morning light filtered through the wide windows of Starspoon's newly refurbished conference room. Tali sat at the table, the tablet in front of her glowing softly as she reviewed her notes from the past week. She had spent long hours observing operations, jotting down inefficiencies, and speaking quietly with some of her coworkers, those who weren't outright hostile toward her. Today, she was to present her findings to Wraith. Her nerves were coiled tight, but she tried to steady herself. This was important, not just for her new role but for the changes she hoped to see take root. The door slid open, and Wraith entered, his presence commanding as always. He wore a dark suit tailored to perfection, the material subtly shimmering in the sunlight. His sharp gaze found her immediately, and for a moment, Tali felt as if he could see straight into her soul. "Good morning," he said, taking a seat across from her. "Good morning, sir," Tali replied, sitting straighter. Wraith gestured toward the tablet. "You've had a week to observe. I'd like to hear your thoughts." Tali nodded, tapping the screen to bring up her report. "I focused on 3 main areas: employee behavior, customer experience, and operational efficiency. In all 3, there are significant issues that need addressing." She took a deep breath and began her presentation. She spoke of the disrespectful attitudes displayed by many employees, the inconsistent quality of food, and the lack of accountability among the management team. She highlighted specific incidents she had witnessed and included customer feedback she had collected. Wraith listened intently, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt, letting her finish before leaning back in his chair. "You've been thorough," he said finally, his tone neutral. "But tell me, Tali, what do you think is the root of these problems?" Tali hesitated. She had thought about this question, but saying it aloud to Wraith felt daunting. "I think," she began cautiously, "it's a lack of empathy. Most of the employees see customers as transactions, not people. And that attitude starts at the top. If the managers don't care, why should the staff?" Wraith's gaze sharpened, and Tali worried she had said too much. But then he nodded slowly. "Empathy," he repeated. "It's not a word often associated with business. But you're right. Without it, there's no trust, no loyalty. And without those, a business will crumble." Tali felt a flicker of relief. "I think we need to start by setting a better example. If the management shows respect and care, it will trickle down to the staff and, eventually, to the customers." Wraith leaned forward, his elbows resting on the table. "That's a tall order, especially for someone in your position. How do you plan to make it happen?" Tali hesitated again, then spoke with quiet determination. "By proving it works. I've already started small, talking to the staff, showing them respect, listening to their concerns. If they see the benefits, they'll be more likely to follow suit." A small smile tugged at Wraith's lips, an expression so rare it caught Tali off guard. "You've thought this through," he said. "Good. Keep going." Tali's confidence grew as the meeting progressed. Wraith asked probing questions, challenging her ideas but never dismissing them. By the time they finished, she felt a sense of accomplishment she hadn't experienced in years. As the days turned into weeks, Tali's efforts began to show results. She continued to work closely with Wraith, refining her strategies and implementing small changes within the restaurant. She started with simple acts of kindness, complimenting employees on their hard work, thanking them for their contributions, and encouraging them to treat customers with the same respect. Not everyone was receptive. Lorne, in particular, seemed determined to undermine her at every turn. He made snide remarks during team meetings, questioned her decisions, and spread rumors about her special treatment from Wraith. One afternoon, Tali confronted him in the back office. "Why are you doing this?" she demanded, her voice steady despite the anger simmering beneath. "I'm trying to make things better for everyone, including you." Lorne sneered, leaning back in his chair. "Better for everyone? Or just yourself? Don't think I don't see what's going on. You're using Altara's attention to climb the ladder, and when you've gotten what you want, you'll leave the rest of us behind." Tali's fists clenched at her sides. "That's not true. I care about this place and the people who work here. If you'd stop fighting me, you'd see that. Lauren laughed, a harsh sound that grated on her nerves. Save your speeches. You're just a naive girl playing a role you don't deserve. The words stung, but Tali refused to let them break her. You're wrong, she said firmly. And I'll prove it. She turned and left the office, her resolve stronger than ever. Later that evening, Tali found herself in Wraith's office, updating him on her progress. She mentioned the resistance she was facing, though she didn't name names. It's expected, Wraith said, his tone calm. Change is always met with resistance. The key is persistence. You're doing well, Tali. Don't let them shake your confidence. His words were reassuring, but it was the way he said her name that struck her. There was a warmth in his voice, a sincerity that made her chest tighten. Thank you, she said quietly. Wraith studied her for a moment, then stood and walked to the window. The city lights cast a soft glow across his features, highlighting the sharp angles of his face. This isn't just about a restaurant, he said, almost to himself. It's about setting a precedent, proving that even the smallest actions can ripple outward and create something greater. Tali joined him by the window, the silence between them charged with unspoken understanding. For a moment, she allowed herself to admire him, not as the untouchable business mogul, but as a man driven by something deeper than profit. I believe it can work, she said softly. Wraith turned to her, his gaze intense but not unkind. So do I. The air between them felt heavy, and Tali suddenly realized how close they were standing. Her pulse quickened, but she forced herself to stay composed. I should get back to work, she said, stepping away. Wraith nodded, his expression unreadable. Good night, Dottie. Good night, sir. As she left the office, Tali couldn't help but wonder what lay ahead. For the restaurant, for her role, and for the strange, unexpected bond she was forming with Wraith Altara. The dining area of Starspoon buzzed with activity, though the tension among the staff was palpable. Tali could feel it in every clipped conversation and stiff smile. Despite the changes she had implemented, some of which had already begun to yield positive results, resistance still lingered, particularly from Lorne and his closest allies. Standing near the service counter, Tali reviewed her checklist for the day. She had spent the morning overseeing a customer service workshop with Wraith's input, and now it was time to assess how the staff applied what they'd learned. She watched as Kern, one of the more receptive employees, cheerfully interacted with a family seated by the windows. The smile seemed genuine, and the customers appeared pleased. Tali made a quick note of the interaction, her heart lifting slightly. Small victories mattered. Her moment of optimism was short-lived. A commotion near the back of the restaurant drew her attention. Lorne was standing near the kitchen door, berating one of the cooks loudly enough for the entire room to hear. This is unacceptable, Lorne snapped, his voice dripping with disdain. Do you even care about the quality of what you're sending out? The cook, a young alien with nervous eyes, stammered an apology, but Lorne's tirade continued. Tali felt her frustration boil over. She marched toward the scene, determined to put an end to the humiliation. Lorne, she said firmly, her voice cutting through the noise. Can I speak with you for a moment? Lorne turned to her, his expression hardening. I'm in the middle of addressing an issue, and I'm addressing one now, Tali replied, her tone leaving no room for argument. The staff nearby exchanged wary glances as Lorne reluctantly followed Tali into the hallway leading to the storage rooms. What's the problem, Tali? Lorne asked, crossing his arms. The problem is your approach, Tali said, meeting his glare head-on. Yelling at employees in front of customers doesn't solve anything. It only creates more tension. Lorne sneered. You think you know better than me? I've been managing this place for years. I know how to handle incompetence. That's not handling incompetence, Tali shot back. That's tearing someone down. If there's an issue with performance, address it privately and constructively. Lawrence's lips curled into a mocking smile. So this is the kind of leader you are, soft, naive, and completely out of your depth. Tali's pulse quickened, but she refused to let his words shake her. Being a leader isn't about tearing people down to make yourself feel superior. It's about bringing out the best in them. If you can't understand that, maybe you're the one out of your depth. For a moment, silence hung between them, the air thick with tension. Careful, Tali, Lorne said quietly, his voice laced with menace. You're playing a dangerous game. Without waiting for a response, he brushed past her, leaving Tali standing alone in the hallway. Later that evening, Tali found herself once again in Wraith's office, recounting the incident. Wraith listened attentively, his expression unreadable as she spoke. Lorne isn't just resistant, Tali concluded. He's actively working against the changes we're trying to make. I don't know how much longer I can deal with him. Wraith leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. Lorne is a symptom of the larger issue we're addressing, he said. But symptoms can't be ignored. They have to be treated. Dottie frowned. How? He's undermining everything we're trying to build here. Wraith's gaze sharpened. By holding him accountable. Leadership is about making tough decisions, Tali. If someone is a barrier to progress, they have to be removed. The weight of his words settled over Tali. She had never considered herself the type to make such drastic choices. But Wraith was right. If she allowed Lorne's behavior to continue, it would jeopardize everything she had worked for. I'll handle it, she said finally, her voice steady. Wraith studied her for a moment, then nodded. Good. But remember, this isn't just about removing an obstacle. It's about setting a precedent, showing the staff that disrespect and sabotage won't be tolerated. Tali nodded, the resolve in her chest hardening into steel. The opportunity to confront Lorne came sooner than Tali expected. The next day, during the mid-afternoon lull, she found him in the back office, reviewing inventory records. Lorne, she said, stepping inside and closing the door behind her. He looked up, his expression immediately guarded. What now? We need to talk, Tali said, her tone firm. About your role here. Lorne smirked, leaning back in his chair. Is this the part where you tell me I'm fired? Go ahead. I'd love to see how that plays out for you. I'm not firing you, Tali said, though the temptation was strong. But I am giving you a choice. Either you get on board with the changes we're implementing, or you step aside and let someone else take your position. Lorne's smirk faltered, replaced by a flicker of uncertainty. You don't have the authority to make that decision. I do, Tali said. Wraith has made it clear that sabotage won't be tolerated. This isn't a threat. It's a reality. If you can't adapt, you won't have a place here. For a moment, Lorne said nothing, his expression unreadable. Then he stood, towering over her. You think you've won, he said quietly. But you don't understand how this world works. People like me don't just disappear. Tali met his gaze without flinching. Maybe not, but people like me don't back down. With that, she turned and left the office, her heart pounding. She knew she had just made a powerful enemy, but she also knew it was a necessary step. That evening, as she sat alone in the break room, Tali felt the weight of the day pressing down on her. She had taken a stand, but the road ahead felt more daunting than ever. The door opened, and Wraith stepped inside, his presence immediately filling the small space. I heard about your conversation with Lorne, he said, his tone unreadable. Tali looked up at him, unsure of what to expect. Did I do the right thing? Wraith's gaze softened, and he nodded. You did what needed to be done. That's what matters. For the first time in days, Tali felt a flicker of relief. Thank you, she said quietly. Wraith crossed the room and placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch light but grounding. You're stronger than you realize, Tali. Don't forget that. The warmth of his hand lingered even after he left, a small reminder that she wasn't entirely alone in this fight. The evening air hummed with an electric tension as Tali walked into Starspoon's main dining area, her steps measured and deliberate. The restaurant was quieter than usual. Midweek lulls often brought a welcome respite from the crowds. But tonight, the silence carried an edge. Conversations were subdued, glances stolen, and the staff moved as if treading on thin glass. Tali had spent the day reviewing operational reports and customer feedback, her focus narrowing on what more could be done to steer Starspoon toward success. The confrontation with Lorne still lingered in her thoughts, though she had done her best to move past it. His behavior had crossed lines, and her ultimatum was necessary. Whether he chose to cooperate or leave would shape the days ahead. But Tali had no illusions about the challenge of keeping the momentum alive. Her eyes caught a glimpse of Wraith standing by the expansive windows overlooking the bustling street below. His tall, commanding figure seemed almost out of place amidst the modest furnishings of the restaurant. Yet his presence alone elevated the room, like an anchor tethering the chaos of the day to something solid. He turned as if sensing her, and their gazes locked. For a moment Tali hesitated. Despite his support, their dynamic had grown increasingly complex. The professional line they both adhered to so strictly often blurred in the quieter moments between them. An unspoken understanding, a spark that neither seemed ready to name. "Tali," Wraith greeted, his voice smooth as ever. "Good timing. I wanted to discuss something with you." She approached him, standing just close enough to catch the faint scent of his cologne. "Is it about Lorne?" "No," he said, shaking his head. "Lorne's choices are his own now. I've made it clear where we stand." There was a finality to his tone that left no room for debate. Tali nodded, a mixture of relief and curiosity flickering through her. "Then what is it?" Wraith gestured toward a table set apart from the others. On it rested a collection of sleek tablets and scattered data sheets. "I've been analyzing the long-term profitability of Starspoon. There's progress, but we need to accelerate it. I want your perspective on some changes we could implement, something bolder than what we've done so far." Tali glanced at the array of figures, her mind already working. Wraith's confidence in her opinion always caught her off guard, but it also fueled her determination. "All right," she said, pulling out a chair. "Let's take a look." For the next hour, they worked side by side, reviewing proposals and brainstorming strategies. The conversation was focused but fluid, their ideas building on one another in a way that felt natural, almost effortless. As the discussion wound down, Wraith leaned back in his chair, his sharp gaze softening as it rested on Tali. "You've done more here in weeks than most would in months," he said. "But I wonder, why do you care so much?" The question caught Tali off guard. She paused, her thoughts tangling as she searched for the right words. "I think," she began, hesitating. "I think it's because I see what this place could be. It's not just a restaurant, it's a reflection of how people treat each other, how they see value in the everyday. And for too long, that's been ignored." Wraith studied her, his expression unreadable. "And what about you? What do you see for yourself in all of this?" Tali's breath hitched slightly. The way he framed the question felt personal, as if he was asking more than she could articulate. "I'm not sure yet," she admitted. "But I know I don't want to look back and think I didn't try to make something better." A faint smile curved Wraith's lips. "You have a way of seeing the heart of things, Tali. It's rare." His words sent a warmth through her, and for a moment, the room seemed to shrink, the distance between them fading. She glanced down at the tablet in front of her, breaking the spell before it could linger too long. "Thank you," she said softly, the weight of his gaze still on her. As the evening wore on, Tali made her rounds through the restaurant, checking in with the staff and observing the operations. Small changes had begun to take root. Employees greeting customers with more genuine warmth, the kitchen staff taking pride in their work. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. She found herself near the kitchen when a familiar voice stopped her in her tracks. "You think you've won, don't you?" Tali turned to see Lorne standing in the shadow of the doorway, his arms crossed and his expression dark. "I'm not playing a game, Lorne," she said, keeping her tone steady. "That's the problem," he said, stepping closer. "You don't understand what it takes to survive in a place like this. All your talk about respect and empathy, it's naive. People don't change, Tali. Not really." Tali met his glare head-on. "I don't believe that. And if you do, then maybe you're in the wrong place." Lawrence's eyes narrowed, his frustration evident. But instead of lashing out, he turned and walked away, leaving Tali standing alone. Later that night, as the restaurant closed and the staff began cleaning up, Tali lingered by the windows, watching the streetlights flicker in the distance. Her mind swirled with thoughts of the day, of Wraith's faith in her, of the slow but steady progress, and of Lawrence's unyielding resistance. The sound of footsteps approached, and she turned to see Wraith joining her. "Long day," he remarked, his voice low. "Long but productive," Tali replied, offering a faint smile. Wraith nodded, his gaze distant for a moment. "You're handling this better than most would." "I'm just trying to keep up," Tali said, her tone light but truthful. Wraith's eyes met hers, and the intensity in his expression made her pulse quicken. "You're doing more than that, Tali. Don't underestimate yourself." The warmth in his voice, the way he said her name, it was almost too much. Tali looked away, her cheeks flushing despite herself. "Thank you," she murmured. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the silence filled with an unspoken tension. Then Wraith stepped closer, his hand brushing against hers in a gesture that felt both deliberate and hesitant. Tali's breath caught, her heart pounding as she looked up at him. There was something in his gaze, an invitation, a question. But he didn't move further. The moment stretched, charged with possibilities, until Wraith finally stepped back, his expression shifting to something more guarded. "Get some rest," he said, his voice quieter now. "Tomorrow will bring its own challenges." Tali nodded, her chest tight as she watched him walk away. As she turned back to the window, the city lights blurred in her vision, her thoughts a tangled web of emotions she wasn't ready to unravel. Tali awoke to the soft, rhythmic sound of rain tapping against the restaurant's glass windows. The morning light was dim, filtered through the thick clouds hanging low in the sky. It was the kind of day where the world felt suspended, quiet and heavy, as though waiting for something. The day ahead loomed over her like a mountain she couldn't quite scale. Lorne had made his decision to leave Starspoon, which had cast a shadow on the sense of accomplishment Tali had been riding since their latest meeting. His departure didn't just mean losing a key member of the staff, but it also symbolized a deeper fracture in the delicate ecosystem of the restaurant. The system they were working so hard to rebuild had been tested, and Tali wasn't sure if it could survive many more hits. She sighed and rubbed her face, running her fingers through her hair. She could feel the weight of Wraith's earlier words. He had asked her to keep going, to keep believing, but it felt like every step forward came with another obstacle. The demands of the restaurant, the constant pressure to improve, and the unyielding tensions with people like Lorne. It was becoming harder to carry the burden alone. Despite everything, she couldn't bring herself to give up. Starspoon was more than just a business. It had become a mission for her. Every day, it represented something bigger. A desire to prove that people could change, that respect and empathy were worth pursuing, no matter how hard the journey. She wasn't ready to let that go. With a determined exhale, Tali swung her legs over the edge of her bed and stood, stretching out the kinks in her back. There was still work to do, still a chance to fix things. By the time Tali reached Starspoon, the restaurant was already buzzing with early morning preparations. The staff was efficient, their movements coordinated as they set the stage for another day of service. There was a noticeable shift in the atmosphere today. The tension that had been so prevalent in the days before Lawrence's departure seemed to have eased, replaced by an undercurrent of anticipation. People were starting to rally around the vision she had laid out for the future of the restaurant. Wraith was already there, his usual poise and quiet confidence on full display as he met her at the entrance. "I thought you'd be a bit later," he said, his voice calm but tinged with a hint of something softer, something that made her pulse quicken just a bit. Tali gave him a smile, though it didn't quite reach her eyes. Couldn't sleep. Needed to make sure everything was in order. Wraith studied her for a moment, his eyes scanning her face as though weighing her words. "Are you all right?" he asked, his tone gentle but probing. "I'm fine," she replied quickly, more out of habit than conviction. "Just thinking." He didn't push. Instead, he nodded, allowing the moment to pass before leading her toward the back office. "There's something I want to show you." Inside the office, Wraith handed her a tablet, the screen glowing with a series of data points and reports. "I've been working on a new model," he said, his voice low. "One that accounts for both the operational and emotional needs of the team. I think it'll help us balance the workload and improve morale." Tali took the tablet, skimming over the figures and charts. "This is impressive," she said, her brow furrowing as she processed the numbers. "But I'm not sure we can implement all of this at once. The staff will need time to adjust." Wraith leaned against the desk, his arms folded as he watched her. "I know, but if we don't push forward, we risk stagnating. You said it yourself. People need to see that change is possible. That includes the staff." She met his gaze, her heart skipping a beat at the intensity of his look. There was something about him in these moments, something that made her feel like they were in this together, not just professionally but personally. The distance that had existed between them before was vanishing, leaving something new in its wake. "I agree," she said, swallowing the lump in her throat. "But we have to be careful. We don't want to lose momentum. And we can't afford another breakdown like we had with Lorne." Wraith's jaw tightened slightly at the mention of Lorne, but his expression remained neutral. "I know. That's why I'm here. To make sure you don't carry the weight of it alone." Her heart fluttered at his words. She wasn't used to this kind of support, this quiet understanding that seemed to seep into everything he did. But it wasn't just his words. It was his presence. The way he had been there, time and time again, when things seemed the hardest. Tali nodded, taking a deep breath. "All right, let's do it. Let's make this work." The day unfolded at a rapid pace. There were meetings with suppliers, a new menu review, and several staff training sessions. Each task felt more challenging than the last, but Tali found herself leaning on Wraith more than ever before. His calm, collected nature balanced her own mounting frustration as they moved through the hours together. She wasn't sure when exactly it happened, but somewhere along the way, the line between them had shifted. What had once been a strictly professional relationship now seemed to pulse with a subtle tension. A growing connection that neither of them acknowledged aloud, but both felt. By late afternoon, things had calmed down. The dinner rush wasn't far off, but for now, there was a quiet lull. Tali stood at the front of the restaurant, watching the ebb and flow of customers and staff. There was still so much to do, so much to prove, but she felt a glimmer of hope, something she hadn't felt in days. Wraith approached her then, his expression unreadable. "I've been thinking about what you said," he began, his voice soft but serious, "about people needing to see change. You're right, but I think it's more than just the staff. It's the whole environment, the entire culture we're creating here." Tali turned to him, her curiosity piqued. "What do you mean?" "I mean that we need to show the world what Starspoon can be," he said, his eyes gleaming with something almost dangerous. "We need to show them that it's not just about the food. It's about people. And if we can get them to believe that, we'll have more than just a restaurant. We'll have something that changes everything." Tali's pulse quickened at his words. She understood what he was implying, and for the first time in days, she felt a surge of excitement. This was it, the chance to really make a mark, to take things to the next level. But it would require more than just talk. It would require action. Big action. "I'm in," she said, her voice firm. Wraith nodded, his gaze locking onto hers with an intensity that sent a thrill down her spine. "Good. We'll do this together." As the dinner rush began, the atmosphere in Starspoon shifted again. It was as if the weight of the past few days had evaporated, replaced by something more electric, more alive. The staff moved with purpose, their energy infectious, and the customers seemed to sense it. Even the skeptical critics in the corner couldn't deny the change in the air. But as Tali moved through the restaurant, interacting with guests and overseeing the service, she couldn't shake the feeling that the moment they were heading toward was still just beyond their reach. There were still so many variables, so much to lose, and she couldn't let herself forget that. As the night wore on, Wraith found her again, standing near the bar, watching the flow of the evening unfold. "You're thinking too much," he said, his voice warm and teasing. Tali chuckled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. "I can't afford not to." He stepped closer, his presence pulling her attention in a way that felt both comforting and exhilarating. "What if, for once, you let yourself believe it could work?" Tali turned to him, her heart pounding in her chest. She wasn't sure what the future held, or what this feeling between them meant. But in that moment, with Wraith's eyes on her, she didn't care. "I'm ready," she whispered. And together they faced the future, whatever it might bring. The next few weeks passed in a blur. Starspoon was growing, evolving. The changes they had implemented, Wraith systems, Tali's new approach to the staff, the adjustments to the menu, were beginning to show results. The energy in the restaurant had shifted, and it wasn't just the staff that felt it. The customers noticed too. There was a buzz surrounding Starspoon, a sense of anticipation that hadn't been there before. It was like something in the air had changed, and everyone was waiting to see if it would last. Tali stood at the front of the restaurant one evening, watching the hustle and bustle of service unfold in front of her. Wraith was across the room, overseeing the kitchen, his quiet authority evident as the chefs moved fluidly under his direction. Everything was falling into place. But as much as Tali wanted to bask in the satisfaction of their success, there was a nagging thought at the back of her mind. She had always known the path forward wouldn't be easy, but now it seemed as though the real challenges were just beginning. She had hoped that, with Lawrence's departure, the tension in the team would ease. Instead, it seemed that some of the cracks had simply shifted. A new strain had crept into the restaurant, one that was harder to pinpoint. The staff, though improving, still had their moments of doubt, and even Wraith's typically unshakable calm seemed to waver at times. Tali had always prided herself on being able to handle the pressure, to carry the weight of responsibility, but there were moments now when it felt like the burden might crush her. "Are you all right?" Wraith's voice cut through her thoughts, and she turned to find him standing beside her. She forced a smile. "Yeah, just thinking." He studied her for a moment, his gaze softening. "You've been doing a lot of that lately." Tali shrugged, trying to dismiss the lingering unease. "Just trying to figure out how we keep this momentum going." Wraith gave her a small, understanding smile. "You don't have to figure it out alone." The weight of his words hung in the air between them. She knew he meant them. They had worked side by side through every trial so far, and his support had been unwavering. But something about the intensity of his gaze, the way he stood so close to her, made her feel exposed. She couldn't let herself lose focus now, not with everything on the line. "I know," she said softly, her voice betraying a hint of vulnerability she hadn't intended. "But I can't help but feel like we're not out of the woods yet. There's still so much to prove." Wraith's expression softened even further. "You've already proven more than most people ever could, Tali." She looked up at him, his words stirring something in her chest. There was a weight to them, an intimacy that she hadn't expected. It was always there between them, but tonight, it felt different, more palpable. "I don't know if I can keep doing it," she admitted, the quiet uncertainty creeping into her voice. "I don't know if I can keep carrying all of this on my shoulders." Wraith's gaze never wavered, his eyes locking onto hers with an intensity that made her breath catch in her throat. He took a small step closer, closing the distance between them. "You don't have to," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper. "I'm here, Tali. I'm right here." For a moment, the world seemed to fall away. The noise of the restaurant, the weight of their responsibilities. It all faded into the background as Tali looked into Wraith's eyes. There was something there, something unspoken, something that had always been there but had never been so clear. Before she could process the sudden rush of emotions flooding her, Wraith's hand gently cupped her cheek, his touch warm and steady. He leaned in just slightly, his lips so close to hers that she could feel the heat radiating between them. But before anything more could happen, the sound of the kitchen door swinging open interrupted them. Wraith quickly stepped back, and Tali blinked, her heart hammering in her chest. "We should," she began, her voice a little breathless. Wraith nodded, his expression now carefully neutral. "Yeah, We've got work to do. They both turned back to the bustling restaurant, the tension that had built up between them lingering in the air, but neither of them acknowledging it. They had responsibilities. They had people to lead. And right now, that was more important than anything else. The following days continued in a blur of activity. The restaurant's success was undeniable, but it was still fragile. Tali and Wraith had their moments of quiet connection. Brief exchanges where their eyes met in ways that spoke volumes, but they both pushed them aside. There was too much at stake to allow anything personal to interfere. But the truth was, the boundaries between them were becoming harder to maintain. Tali knew that, and she could see it in Wraith's eyes as well. The way he was always there when she needed him, his presence a constant source of comfort. There was a part of her that wondered if it was just the stress of running a restaurant together, or if something more was growing between them. But each time she caught herself thinking about it, she pushed the thought away, afraid that it would distract her from the bigger picture. And then, one evening, it all came to a head. It was late, after the dinner rush, when the restaurant had emptied out and the staff was winding down. Tali stood by the bar, reviewing the night's performance with a notepad in hand, when Wraith approached her. His face was serious, his usual calm demeanor replaced with a quiet intensity that made her stomach flutter. "Tali," he said, his voice low, "we need to talk." Her pulse quickened, and she felt a tightening in her chest. "What's wrong?" Wraith took a step closer, his eyes never leaving hers. "There's something I've been thinking about, something I need to say." Tali's heart raced, but she stayed calm, meeting his gaze with a steady, searching look. "What is it?" Wraith hesitated for a moment before speaking again, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think it's time we stop pretending there's nothing between us." Tali's breath caught in her throat. She could feel her heart pounding against her ribs, the words hanging in the air between them, heavier than anything they had ever said before. Wraith took another step forward, closing the space between them, his presence overwhelming. "I've tried to keep things professional, but I can't deny it anymore. The way I feel about you, it's not something I can just push aside." Tali stood frozen, her mind racing. She had known this was coming, in a way. But the reality of it, the raw honesty in his words, was something she hadn't prepared for. Wraith gently cupped her face in his hands, his touch gentle yet firm. "I don't want to hide it anymore. Tali, I want you. And I think you want me too." The world seemed to stop as Tali looked into his eyes, her heart full of everything she had been holding back. For the first time in what felt like forever, she let go of the fear that had been holding her back. And as their lips met, it was as though everything they had been building together, Starspoon, their connection, their unspoken bond, fell into place.